The high Swiss Alps in the springtime of 1921. In a valley nestled between the blue, snow-dusted peaks, there is a curl of steam rising. A steam train is winding its way through the mountains. And from out of her carriage window, Miss Letitia Keen is determined to take in every detail of the spectacular landscape unfolding on the other side of the pane. She observes the snow still settled on the highest parts of the mountains, and lower down, the wildflowers that have burst into bloom on the grassy slopes. She notes gentian edelweiss and alpine roses in shades of pink and white. She peers down with a thrill whenever the train crosses one of the alpine wooden bridges that span deep gorges where rushing waters brim with bright blue snowmelt. Miss Keen's final destination is the Monastery of St Bernard, a former working monastery which was then an elegant mountain hotel. It had been converted into accommodation just after the war. The high alpine air, not to mention the stunning landscape, at St Bernard were well known for their restorative properties, and, in fact, there was a long tradition of health and relaxation at the monastery. The gardens, tended by the handful of monks who still resided in the eastern wing, contained medicinal herbs that had been cultivated for 400 years. All of which is to say, Miss Keen's stay at the monastery promised to be a peaceful break. And certainly she deserved one. She'd been travelling for 3 months now, solving mysteries on every corner of the continent. First, there was the matter of the Baroness de Chantilly's 5th husband, who had not vanished at all, but had simply decided to take up beekeeping in Provence without informing his wife. Then came the peculiar business of Geneva involving the diplomat's daughter and the supposedly haunted music box. After that, a tedious week in Lyon dealing with a case of mistaken identity at a textile factory. Miss Keen was exhausted. Her normally immaculate tweed was beginning to look travel-worn. Her sensible walking shoes needed resoling, and her patience had worn thinner than the sheets at the last pension where she had stayed. A fortnight of mountain air, regular meals, and absolutely no mysteries whatsoever. Yes, that was what she needed. With a whistle, the train pulled into the small mountain town of Bergdorf at precisely 3:30 in the afternoon. Right on schedule. Miss Keen had to hand it to the Swiss. They were as punctual and precise as the watches they were so famous for making. A deep green motor car was waiting just outside the station, sent by the hotel. Miss Keen's driver spoke very little, and Miss Keen was grateful, because this meant instead that he concentrated on navigating the steep mountain road, bristling with switchbacks, which led up to the monastery. Miss Keen noticed his steady hands on the wheel, the way he slowed before each turn. She was pleased to see how competent he was. She appreciated competency very much. As the car gradually drove up the road, the Monastery of St Bernard revealed itself bit by bit. First, a bell tower appeared above the tree line, then honey-coloured stone walls. Finally, as her car rounded the last curve, Miss Keen took in the full structure. A sprawling complex of buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The famous gardens cascaded down the southern slope in a series of terraced beds. Behind it all, the mountains rose, reaching to the sky. The hotel manager, Herr Gottfried, met Miss Keen at the entrance. He was a neat man in his 50s, with thinning hair combed precisely across his scalp and impeccably polished spectacles. As he led Miss Keen to her room, he gave her a brief lecture on the hotel's history. The monastery was built in 1521 by Benedictine monks. The order had maintained it until 1919, when their dwindling numbers had forced them to sell most of the property. The monks who remained, 5 in total, lived in the eastern wing and continued to tend the famous gardens as their brothers had done for centuries. Miss Keen's room was on the 2nd floor, facing south toward the gardens. It was simple but comfortable. White walls, a narrow bed with a goose-down quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a small desk positioned by the window. The window itself was a tall Gothic arch that framed the view. Miss Keen stood at the windowsill for a long moment, watching the light of the late afternoon sun play across the mountain slopes, drenching them in amber. Already, she was beginning to feel rested, peaceful. She unpacked with her usual care. Her spare dress hung in the wardrobe. Her lavender soap went on the washstand. Her notebook and fountain pen found their place on the desk, though she had promised herself she would use them only for sketching wildflowers and recording pleasant observations about the mountain scenery. No mysteries, no cases, no suspicious circumstances requiring investigation. Dinner was served at 7 in what had once been the monastery's refectory. Long tables ran the length of the room beneath the vaulted ceiling, supported by thick wooden beams. Miss Keen was seated at a table near the windows. She took the chance to observe her fellow guests, without appearing to do so. She may have been on holiday, but habits were habits after all. There were perhaps 20 guests in the hotel, all told. Most seemed to be well-to-do Europeans, enjoying the mountain air. And some of them were already known to Miss Keen, either through personal acquaintance or by reputation. At the table nearest the door sat Dr. Heinrich Richter, a German botanist who Miss Keen recognized from a lecture she had attended in Berlin 3 years prior. He was making notes in a leather journal between spoons of his soup, occasionally glancing towards the gardens with what seemed like professional interest. His reputation was formidable. He had published extensively on alpine flora and medieval herbalism. At a nearby table were Colonel Morrison and his wife, elderly English expatriates, discussing the comparative merits of Swiss versus Austrian mountain resorts. Alone in the corner sat a young woman of perhaps 25, with anxious eyes and ink-stained fingers. Miss Keen noticed those ink stains were an unusual shade. Not the typical blue-black of fountain pen ink, but rather the brownish tint of sepia, the sort used in botanical illustration. She kept a sketchbook beside her plate and seemed more interested in drawing the vaulted ceiling than in eating her dinner. Also present, though seated separately at a table near the kitchens, were the staff, a handful of maids and kitchen workers, including a young woman with red-rimmed eyes, who the other maids called by Greta. Greta's hands, though she wore the rough uniform of a housemaid, were rather fine-boned and delicate. The way she held her knife and fork suggested someone more accustomed to formal dining than one might expect from domestic staff. At last, entering near silently through a side door, were two of the monastery's remaining monks. They dressed in simple brown habits and sat down to their meal after a murmured prayer. Miss Keen savoured her meal, an excellent venison stew, and observed. She noticed the fresh ink stains on Dr. Ringer's fingers and the dirt under his nails that suggested he did more than observe plants. He worked with them directly. She noticed that the young woman with the sketchbook had calluses on her fingers in unusual places, not from writing, but from something else. She noticed the way Greta's eyes kept darting nervously towards the gardens, even in the darkness. She noticed the reassuring smile the elder monk gave Greta when their eyes met. And she noticed something else curious. When one of the other maids addressed Greta in rapid Swiss German, there was the briefest hesitation before Greta responded, as if she were translating in her head, rather than understanding instinctively. After dinner, before the light had completely faded, Miss Keen took a turn about the gardens. She had toured some of the most spectacular gardens on the continent, but none had impressed her so much as the garden at St Bernard's. They'd been cut into the mountainside with commendable ingenuity. Gravel paths wound between the terraced beds, each level connected to the next by stone steps. Small plaques identified each section, medicinal herbs here, culinary plants there. A section devoted entirely to plants mentioned in medieval manuscripts. The air was sharp and clear, carrying the mingled scents of thyme, lavender, sage, and a dozen other herbs she could not immediately identify. The plants were healthy and vigorous despite the altitude. She could have stayed there for hours more, and would have, if darkness hadn't fallen. She returned to her room, read for an hour from the volume of modernist poetry she had packed in her suitcase, and fell asleep as soon as her head met her clean, crisp pillowcase. The next morning, Miss Keen woke to a voice below her window. She rose, pulled on her dressing gown, and looked out to see Herr Gottfried, the hotel manager, talking to the elderly monk she had seen at dinner. The monk said nothing in return, but both men were looking anxiously toward the gardens. Miss Keen recognized those expressions. Something was wrong. At breakfast, she learned what exactly was amiss. During the night, a plant had been harvested from the garden. Not stolen exactly. No, its stem had been cut at precisely the right point to encourage new growth, and the garden beds otherwise undisturbed. But how had the intruder found their way in the first place? The garden gates were locked all night. They had been locked when Herr Gottfried opened them in the morning. There were no footprints on the gravel plants. Nothing else had been touched. It was as if the plants had simply vanished into the thin alpine air. And that wasn't all. When Herr Gottfried poured Miss Keen her cup of coffee, he confided that this was not the first time such an incident had taken place. In fact, this morning was the 7th morning in a row that a plant had gone missing. The plants were different each time. They were always harvested with the utmost care, and as to how the thief had made their way past the locked gate, well, it was a mystery. A mystery. Miss Keen stirred her coffee thoughtfully. She had promised herself no mysteries. And yet, 7 plants from 7 nights. The precision of it was intriguing. The expertise of this surreptitious gardener was commendable. And there was something else. Something about the number 7 that tickled at the back of her mind. Some half-remembered detail from her academic days. She thought. Why not? After all, she had learned last night that she actually didn't much care for modernist poetry, and in the absence of a book to read, she might as well amuse herself with a mystery. Which is not to say she regretted packing the modernist poetry. It came in very useful that morning. She sat in the garden and pretended to read it while she was actually taking in the crime scene. She watched the elderly monk, whose name was Brother Thomas, as he worked steadily. He went from bed to bed, weeding, watering, and checking that each plant was healthy. No wonder, she thought, the garden was thriving. Brother Thomas was clearly a green thumb. When Miss Keen walked past him on one of the paths, she noticed that he did not greet her. In fact, he did not seem to speak at all. When she made discreet inquiries with Herr Gottfried, she found that the monk had taken a vow of silence 30 years ago and had not spoken a word since. He communicated, when necessary, through gestures and written notes. That afternoon, Miss Keen positioned herself in the conservatory with tea and her notebook. She began listing the stolen plants based on Herr Gottfried's account. Valerian, St. John's wort, feverfew, meadowsweet, comfrey, chamomile, and yarrow. Then she added her observations. Dr. Richter was an obvious suspect. He had botanical expertise, and Miss Keen had noted him observing the gardens at odd hours. The young woman with the sketchbook had those unusual calluses. Had she been weeding garden beds, wielding a pair of secateurs? And then there was the maid, Greta. Greta seemed nervous about something, and there was that curious hesitation when she spoke Swiss German, as if the language did not come naturally to her. Finally, there was Brother Thomas. He had complete access to the gardens, and though he was a man of God, Miss Keen could not place him entirely above suspicion. She read over the list of stolen plants again, then stood up and went hurriedly to the hotel library. She suspected she would find the type of volume she was looking for there, and indeed she did. A compendium of medieval herbal remedies written by a monk who had lived in this very monastery in the 15th century. She flipped through the pages until she found a recipe which used those exact 7 plants. A remedy for persistent headaches and nervous tension. Not a dangerous ailment, but certainly an uncomfortable one. The remedy required the herbs to be harvested fresh over 7 consecutive nights. Miss Keen tapped her pen against her notebook. Someone needed this remedy. Someone with botanical knowledge. Someone who couldn't simply ask for the herbs without raising questions. The next morning, she rose before dawn and positioned herself at her window. She watched Brother Thomas emerge and unlock the garden gate. She watched him walk through the beds and saw the exact moment he discovered 7 more plants missing. But she also noticed something else. He did not look surprised. He almost looked satisfied. That afternoon, Miss Keen requested a private word with Herr Gottfried. In his neat office, she asked to see the hotel's guest books from the past few months. She worked through them systematically, and every now and then stopped to make a note in her own notebook. After she was finished with the guest book, something else caught her eye. A leather-bound album filled with pictures from the monastery's early days as a hotel. In one photograph, she saw Brother Thomas standing with a young woman, clearly teaching her about the plants. The caption read, "Brother Thomas instructs Miss Beatrice Hoffman in the monastery's herbal traditions." Miss Hoffman, the young woman with the sketchbook, currently staying at the hotel, had signed the register as Miss B. Winters. But those unusual calluses on her fingers, they matched exactly what one would get from years of scientific plant illustration. And Beatrice Hoffman had been, according to a notation in the guest book, an accomplished botanical illustrator. Miss Keen sat back. Miss Hoffman had clearly fallen on hard times. Her dress was respectable, but not fine, and she was staying in one of the hotel's smaller, less expensive rooms. She had, in the past, come to the monastery to learn from Brother Thomas. Now she was in need of herbs for a remedy. Miss Keen surmised the remedy would be costly to buy from a pharmacy. But Miss Hoffman may well be too proud to simply ask for the herbs, as the request would reveal her straitened circumstances. But wait. Miss Keen turned back to the photograph album and studied the picture more carefully through her reading glasses. The young woman in the photograph had lighter hair than Miss Winters, and the bone structure of her face, while similar, was not quite the same. Miss Keen's mind worked rapidly. Two women, both connected to the monastery, both with botanical knowledge. She requested one more thing from Herr Gottfried, the staff employment records. He produced them with some curiosity. Miss Keen ran her finger down the list until she found it. Greta Müller, hired 3 weeks ago to replace a maid who had left to marry. References from a household in Zurich. But when Miss Keen asked to see the letter of reference, Herr Gottfried admitted it had been misplaced during filing. Miss Keen smiled. The pieces were falling into place with satisfying precision. That evening, Miss Keen did something rather unusual. She went to the chapel where the monks still held their prayers. She found Brother Thomas there and knelt beside him. In a low voice, she explained what she had deduced. 2 former students, she said. 2 sisters, perhaps, or close friends. Miss Beatrice Hoffman, the botanical illustrator, staying as a guest under the name of Winters, and her companion, posing as the maid Greta, whose fine hands and hesitant Swiss German had given her away. One suffering from persistent headaches, the other helping to gather the remedy. A kind teacher had deliberately left his garden accessible, knowing exactly which plants would be taken and ensuring they were mature enough to harvest. A vow of silence meant he could not be questioned too closely about what he knew. Brother Thomas did not speak, of course, but he turned to look at her. His gaze confirmed everything. Miss Keen returned to her room and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Herr Gottfried, explaining that she had solved the mystery. The thefts would cease immediately. The solution, however, was delicate. She strongly suggested the matter be closed without further investigation, as no real harm had been done, and the motivation had been charitable. The second letter was to Miss Hoffman, suggesting that if she required medicinal herbs in the future, she might simply speak with Brother Thomas, who she understood was quite generous in sharing his knowledge and his garden's bounty with serious students of botany. The third was addressed simply to Greta, noting that her secret was safe and that positions as housemaids were difficult to maintain when one had clearly never scrubbed a floor in one's life. When Herr Gottfried came to her room, Miss Keen was firm. The garden had not been harmed. The herbs had been harvested with expert care, and surely a hotel housed in a former monastery should understand the value of mercy and discretion. Herr Gottfried studied her thoughtfully, then nodded. He trusted her judgment, he said. That evening, Miss Keen observed Miss Hoffman departing in a motor car, her small case packed, her anxious expression replaced by something like relief. Beside her sat the young woman who had been called Greta, now wearing a simple travelling dress rather than a maid's uniform. The two women's heads were bent together in conversation, and they looked like what they truly were, companions helping each other through difficult times. They'd both left an envelope for Miss Keen at the front desk. Inside was a beautiful botanical illustration of alpine lavender and a note. Thank you for your understanding. The remedy is already helping. Miss Keen spent the remaining days of her holiday doing exactly what she had promised. She walked in the mountains. She sketched wildflowers. She read poetry in the garden while Brother Thomas worked nearby, occasionally catching her eye with what might have been a smile. She took her meals in the refectory and slept soundly. On her last morning, she found a small package outside her door. Inside was a sachet of dried lavender and a note in a beautiful medieval script. Pax vobiscum. Peace be with you. Miss Keen tucked the note into her notebook, packed her case with care, and prepared to return to the world of trains and cities and mysteries. Her motor car descended the road, and the mountains receded behind her. Miss Keen settled back and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Another mystery solved. We'll leave our story there for this evening. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm heading to the mountains of the Tyrol this summer. Can't wait. Sleep well and sweet dreams.